The department has made thousands of dollars investments over the last few years in bringing McNabbs and Lawlers Islands up to provincial park status. We're going to continue to make those investments. We continue to work with the Friends of McNabbs and Lawlers Islands, and as the member opposite is fully aware, that is an ongoing rapport with the community.
The Honourable Member for Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Fisheries. This past summer, fishermen across Shelburne County and District 34 maintained a peaceful protest near Cape Sable Island Causeway to draw our attention to the damaged lobsters many fishermen observed in the past season. When damaged lobsters are caught, their prices reduced with the current market. Reduced prices is not something any fisherman can afford. My question to the Minister is, what assistance will be forthcoming to help this group deal with this issue?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the honourable member across the way, that has been an issue that has been brought to my attention and brought to the department's attention earlier in the summer. It's an issue that DFO has made the decisions on. That the lobster damage that they were saying wasn't only in that area of Shelburne. It was right up the coast, right up into Herring Cove, actually, where the similar damage was. So the DFO didn't believe that actually all the damage was caused by scallop draggers. So, Mr. Speaker, as far as I know, there'll be no compensation from DFO or anyone on that issue.
The Honourable Member for Shelburne on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, on their own initiative, these fishermen have created a remote underwater camera project to gather information showing the damage done to lobsters during the fragile molting process, as well as lobster habitat. Mr. Speaker, I will table a letter dated August the 18th from the Minister stating he cannot support this project. Mr. Speaker, my question is, why has the Minister turned his back on fishermen who are trying to protect this valuable resource?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Well, again, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know the issue of the damaged lobsters, and I know it very well. And as I said before, the DFO has considered that a storm damage issue. It had nothing to do with actually the scallop dragging in that area. We all know, Mr. Speaker, that soft-shell lobsters are found on sand bottom. They go to the sand bottom to molt. The scallops were fished on rock bottom. So, Mr. Speaker, DFO tells me that they consider that whole shore. One storm caused a considerable amount of damage to lobster, and that was their suspicion. That was their explanation for that. So, Mr. Speaker, you'll have to refer to DFO for more information.
The Honourable Member for Shelburne on his final supplementary.
I can't resist, Mr. Speaker. After last night's debate, I think he was wrong. And Mr. Speaker, this minister has funded other research projects in other areas of this problem, but has turned his back on these fishermen. Mr. Speaker, why is the minister not supportive of Shelburne County underwater camera project when in the past his department has funded projects through the Fishermen and Science Research Society?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Mr. Speaker, that issue is not a mandate of the Department of Fisheries and Aquaculture in the province of Nova Scotia. That's an issue for DFO. And Mr. Speaker, when he talks about, he figures I was wrong. I figure he was wrong when he voted against the fishermen in the last budget on our loan for licenses program. Mr. Speaker, that was the biggest single investment in the fishery in the province of Nova Scotia since 1936, and he decided to vote against it.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia's United Way agencies have been trying to convince the province for years to establish a 211 service. A central agency where a single phone call would connect people to services would be especially valuable to newcomers, seniors, and people with disabilities. It would help people navigate the complex maze of government and nonprofit agencies to find the services that they need. My question through you, Mr. Speaker, is what is your department doing to advance the implementation of a 211 system for Nova Scotia?
The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Speaker, and I think the host will remember, I think it was 2 years ago, that the department actually provided $100,000 so the 211 system and its potential for Nova Scotia could be assessed.
The Honourable the Member for Halifax Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I am discouraged to hear that that was a full 2 years ago, because we want to see some action in this province and not just a lot of talk. Mr. Speaker, success hinges on access, and Nova Scotians do not have access to the information that they need to access services. Residents in big cities like Toronto, Edmonton, and Calgary have such a system, and smaller cities like Niagara Falls, Windsor, and Simcoe have access 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to a 211 system. Mr. Speaker, the province of British Columbia announced last spring that they will actually introduce a province-wide system. So my question to the minister is, does your government support a province-wide 211 service for Nova Scotia?
The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, when the 211 proposal was put to the government, it was going to be a cost entirely borne by the government, and I think the operating cost was $1 million a year. At those times, government had to assess its priorities, and 211 was not deemed to be the top priority, so the government did not proceed.
The Honourable the Member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the costs that the minister refers to are certainly, very affordable, especially when you compare it to the money wasted on the ATV program, which had to be rolled back very recently. There are a lot of things we can point to in this province that have been ill-founded and not thought out. But a 211 system has been proven in other places, and its value is clear. The benefits far outweigh the cost. And in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, 187 companies have offered to help. Those are our health organizations, companies, and community groups. They've offered to support this system because they know how much it's needed. My question to the minister is, when will your government stop dragging its heels and introduce real solutions like the 211 service for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, it was about 2 months ago that I met with representatives of 211 again and to discuss it, and I can say that their proposal has moderated from the first time they came to government. They are now, if this service should ever be implemented here, they are prepared to get some private partners. I did ask the United Way at that time, to be quite frank, Mr. Speaker, if this was their #1 priority, would they fund it?
The Honourable the Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Natural Resources. The brown spruce longhorn beetle was recently discovered in the town of Pictou, and notices have been received by local residents outlining restrictions on the movement of spruce roundwood. And I will table a copy of that letter received by the residents. In presentation to the Resource Committee in May 2007, Greg Cunningham of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency said that this insect was initially found in Nova Scotia but misidentified as early as 1989. So my question, since we have been living with this insect for almost 20 years, can the minister explain to this House what threat this pest poses to healthy red spruce trees?
The Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for his interest in this alien insect that's invaded our shores. We assume it's through the port of Halifax. In Europe and Asia, where it's native, it attacks the Norway spruce, but it has adapted since it's come to Nova Scotia, and it's attacking both the red, the white, and the black spruce, as well as the few Norway spruce that may have been planted in the province. And typically it just attacks those that are under some stress. But the main concern from the point of view of the province is that it potentially makes things more difficult for us to export our wood products from Nova Scotia. And clearly we want to do everything that we can in conjunction with the CFIA to make sure that the markets remain open.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly we've had many woodlot owners affected by this pest, and it appears that the insect continues to spread, and I know woodlot owners are justifiably worried. If this insect had been present for at least 20 years and officially identified since at least 1999, I assume that there's lots of research, ample research that would have been done by the Minister's Department or by CFIA. So my question through you, Mr. Speaker, what research then has been undertaken to establish that this insect is any more damaging than our native species of beetles?
The Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for his questions and his concerns. And the member opposite is right. There are certainly lots of indigenous beetles that are equally as damaging as the brown spruce longhorn beetle. The concern here is that because it's not an indigenous insect, that we want to make sure that we contain it so that there be no impact on our ability to export Nova Scotia forest products.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Knowing the hardships that took place in the current zone where it's quarantined, and there's certainly many unanswered questions. How widespread is the insect in the province? Are present forest practices contributing to its spread? Does it actually attack healthy spruce trees? So my question, when, Mr. Speaker, is this minister going to review the scientific research to get the real facts and on the actual risk of the brown spruce longhorn beetle and whether it can or cannot be contained within the areas?
Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources.
Yes, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, the lead for this file does rest with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and the federal government, but we're very pleased to have been able to work constructively with them, the Maritime Lumber Bureau, the Forestry Products Association of Nova Scotia, and indeed the whole industry and all the other stakeholders through a committee. We feel we've got some of the best entomologists in the world studying this insect and how to best contain it as we work through the management plan and indeed have taken the appropriate steps to try to at least slow the spread of the beetle. Ideally, we'd like to eradicate it. We know that that is going to be a challenge.
The Honourable the Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has shown a flair for private health care. We know the minister in the past has said everything is on the table. This is evident from the use of private staffing agencies for nursing staff and investments in private companies. Our public health care system is in crisis right now, Mr. Speaker. Your government is having difficulty recruiting and retaining healthcare professionals, and Nova Scotians cannot always access the care they need when they need it. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health why he is still making investments in private companies instead of strengthening our public health care system.
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I can also underline the issue that we brought out yesterday with the press release about wait times, about the people that are receiving services, the reduction that we've had in wait times, whether it be for long-term care or whether it be in orthopedic surgery. Mr. Speaker, I can say that today that 250 patients have been able to have their services through a service like Scotia Surgery and have thoroughly appreciated that service and have a 99% approval rate.
The Honourable the Member for Sackville-Cobequid on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to table a page printed from the Copeman Healthcare Centre website, another private healthcare company which clearly states that they are planning to build a facility here in Halifax. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, can he explain to this House and all Nova Scotians what services he plans to privatize next that would encourage Copeman Healthcare Centres to build a private clinic here in Halifax?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to privatize the opposition. But, Mr. Speaker, since I can't do that, I can say that we have not been addressed, we have not been approached by this company to provide services in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable the Member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Mr. Speaker, we're not for sale. Maybe they are, but we're not for sale, Mr. Speaker. We all know that there are underutilized hospital operating rooms in our province, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable the Member for Sackville-Cobequid has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know in our province today there's underutilized operating rooms throughout this province. But the Minister of Health continues to seek the private sector to address issues that this government should address, Mr. Speaker, under a public health care system. They refuse to do that, Mr. Speaker. We're eroding our public health care system. Our professionals who work in that system, Mr. Speaker, they are eroding it, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, and I hope he can answer the question, Mr. I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, through you, Mr. Speaker, why isn't your government and his utilizing the public system before turning to the private sector to deliver health care in our province, Mr. Speaker? Why?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, we couldn't possibly give away the opposition. We can't even give them away. Mr. Speaker, we're doing it because it is the right thing to do. We're going to serve patients when they're just going to sit on their hands and do nothing. Look at them. They can't do anything.
Please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members has expired. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to draw the attention of the House to the West Gallery, where Claude Poirier is here from Cheticamp. Claude is a small business person in Cheticamp. He's been actively involved in municipal, provincial, and federal elections for some time, and this is his first visit to Province House, so I would ask all members to give him a warm welcome.
The Honourable the Government Deputy House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Please call Bill number 187, the Child Pornography Reporting Act.
Bill 187, the Child Pornography Act. The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am very pleased today to rise in the House and move second reading of Bill number 187, the Child Pornography Reporting Act. I'm very proud, Mr. Speaker, that we're joining other provinces in our efforts to do our part in Nova Scotia to prevent the proliferation of child pornography. Manitoba and Ontario are well on their way to supporting police in their investigations with provincial legislation, and I, for one, am proud that we also recognize that need and are acting on it. In September in Quebec, provincial and territorial justice ministers agreed that Canada's response to child pornography could be enhanced by federal legislation requiring any agency whose services could be used to facilitate the commission of online child pornography offences to report suspected material. Some people may ask, Mr. Speaker, why we need this legislation at all. I wish we did not, Mr. Speaker, but sadly, and even in this province, we do. Child pornography is a worldwide issue with the increased use of the internet, and it is incumbent upon all of us to do our part to track down those who are exploiting children. It is our responsibility to protect Nova Scotia children, and our government will do everything we can to do that. With this law, we're asking Nova Scotians to do their part as well. We cannot leave it up to the victims, children, to report abuse, just as we cannot expect children to report physical abuse. Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker. The purpose of the Child Pornography Reporting Act is not to punish Nova Scotians, but to empower them to step forward and report this horrendous crime. If someone sees something they find disturbing, even if it is on a computer at their work, they'll now be protected from repercussions for reporting this to police. According to the RCMP, who were in favor of this bill, that presently there are organizations, businesses, and persons out there that believe, based on privacy mechanisms within their organization, they cannot release certain information to police. The benefit of the new act is that it will give protection to those who do come forward, including these internet service providers, to report to police what might otherwise be considered by them to be personal information and facilitate the increased reporting of this deplorable crime. I'm told, Mr. Speaker, that there are times when police do an investigation and strongly suspect that information is available that would further an investigation but face challenges in getting that information because of privacy issues. This new piece of legislation would make it clear to those organizations, businesses, and persons that they're now being supported by the government in supplying the proper authorities this information. As well, some Nova Scotians may not know what to do if they come across these exploitive images. And to quote Sergeant Mike Burns of the Halifax Regional Police, who was told when we introduced the bill, and I quote, "This is an incremental step to try and lay out in no uncertain terms to the general public that if you see these images or you come across them accidentally, you can't just turn a blind eye of indifference to it." Some may question why we are bringing in this bill, but I want every Nova Scotian to know it is because our government does believe in fighting crime together. We've been very clear through our crime strategy, Time to Fight Crime Together. That plan has helped us focus on some very specific crimes that affect everyone in this province. Today's legislation is a good example of government doing what it can to intervene when crimes are affecting our children and putting them at risk. If this bill, Mr. Speaker, helps even but one child who is being lured through the internet, it will have been worth it. We must act to prevent child abuse, and indeed that is what child pornography amounts to. This is also, Mr. Speaker, about being a deterrent. It is about a concerted effort to do what we can, where we can, and in fact, in the interest of the protection of children. Mr. Speaker, I know that those that work within our ICE units here in Nova Scotia, for those men and women that take on that task, it is not a pleasant one at all. It's one that requires of them counseling. It requires a rotational basis. When we talk about the reporting and the people that deal with this, they are trained experts in their field that are out there, Mr. Speaker, when they have to view these images and not know necessarily where a child who's being exploited, where they may be. And the fact that, Mr. Speaker, we see the numbers that we do, statistically saying and suggesting that there are over 5,000 active accounts of viewing child pornography in this province, that is something of concern to one and all, Mr. Speaker. And this is not about vexatious or frivolous claims that anyone would make. It's about having a designated unit of professionals. It's about recognizing as well that we at the national table, Mr. Speaker, are working to respond. And the Government of Canada, hopefully in their legislative mandate, will bring forward encompassing legislation to deal with this. But I do want to applaud the efforts within Manitoba, as well as in the province of Ontario, that as we work together to deal with this issue, that we will, as I say, if we achieve but protecting one child, then this legislation, Mr. Speaker, will have been worth it. And Mr. Speaker, I hope that the House will see the wisdom to move this forward, that I do welcome any of the comments from our colleagues here in the House, that if there is areas that they feel that could be addressed or items in the legislation they would like to have clarity on, I'm more than pleased, Mr. Speaker, to work with our officials, with our policing community, and to recognize as well that what we're responding to is a national initiative and something that we in Nova Scotia can take action on rather than waiting for Ottawa to deal with our jurisdiction in the province of Nova Scotia. And indeed, we'll work with other governments, the Government of Ontario led by a Liberal administration, and in Manitoba with regards to an NDP government there, Mr. Speaker, that we have a pan-Canadian response, and that I truly hope that the Parliament of Canada will deal with this issue as quickly as possible. But in the interim, we can act, and we can act now. As well, there is a national organization, a non-government organization, cybertip.ca, that indeed collects that information. And if collectively we can put all of our efforts together to protect children, then I think we will have done well by this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the honourable member from Timberley Prospect.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward over the next few moments making some comments and passing on some suggestions that I've received from various people in the policing forces of our province. In particular, I want the minister to know that I have a number of my past students who are police officers, both with the RCMP and with municipal forces across the province. And the question that they've been asked is this, or they've been asking me, is this a well-thought-out piece of legislation that will encourage more charges that stick and convictions that follow? That's the question that some of my past students who are in the police forces are asking me as a legislator. And the answer I give back to them is, well, we'll have to wait and see. We'll have to wait and see, but in the meantime, there's been various people who've been having their say on this, and I'm sure when we proceed to law amendments, we will hear from other members of the community, the police force, lawyers, and various other people who are looking at what this piece of legislation is going to do to protect children in this province. In particular, I think I should begin by tabling the Sunday Herald of November the 2nd, 2008, and that is, of course, from the editorial page. It jumped out and grabbed me. I made it in bold print, and I have it available for members who would like to have a look at it. I encourage all members of this House to look carefully at this editorial. And the headline says, "It's a bill with no bite. The provincial Tories have introduced a new child pornography reporting bill, but whom is it aimed at, really?" And if I can quote from this for a moment, it has already been tabled. "The computer technician who stumbles across filth on someone else's computer, the internet service provider that doesn't do enough to bar access to illegal websites, the bystander who happens upon a pervert at an internet cafe, the babysitter or the spouse who discovers a family member's cache of horrifying pictures." All questions that are asked in the editorial in the first 6 lines of the editorial, potentially all of the above. But the real answer, the editorial goes on to say, is the voters of Nova Scotia. Now, this is no time to play politics with the justice system. I've been to enough of the minister's announcements to realize there's lots of politics when it comes to dealing with the justice system as it's being delivered by this particular minister. There's no need to have any more photo ops. If we're looking at a piece of legislation that's going to work, let's make it work. Let's make sure that the stakeholders have been consulted and they know of which we speak. So I want to take the minister back to those comments that were directed, and he quoted from Mike Burns, but I'm going to quote from Chris Gorman, who is the detective constable of the Halifax Regional Police Officer, who's been dealing with child pornography cases for 4 years. And Constable Gorman said, and I quote, and I'll table a copy of this, David Jackson's article in the Herald. He said, this is Constable Gorman, he couldn't recall any case in which someone was aware of child pornography and didn't report it. This is a police constable who's got expertise on the spot and knows of what we are going to be dealing with in this House. Let's see what Mike Burns says. And of course, Mr. Burns is another HPD police superintendent. The bill would punish, this comments from Paul McLeod, who was writing in the Metro paper here in Halifax. The bill would punish people who falsely and maliciously report someone accessing child pornography. Halifax Regional Police Superintendent Mike Burns said, quote, he wasn't aware of such a case ever happening. Now, here are 2 front-line police officers. They are at the briefing, they are at the announcement, and neither of them are saying they're not aware of cases of this nature. They have lots of experience. Minister Clark, it says, Mr. McLeod goes on to quote in this particular article, Minister Clark says he could not specifically name any police agency that had requested this new bill. Now, as legislators, it's important to recognize that on certain occasions, we do step up, we make sure that we're ahead of the curve, and maybe this is one of those examples when we go to law amendments, we might realize this government might just be a little bit too far ahead of the curve, but let's wait and see. I'd like to draw the minister's attention, and I urge him to consult Kevin Burke. Kevin Burke once was a constituent of mine. He lives in East Dover. Kevin's still alive and well. They just changed the boundary, Mr. Speaker. So Mr. Burke is now a constituent of the members of Chester St. Margaret's. Kevin Burke is a very well-known lawyer in our community, and Mr. Burke immediately brought up the whole situation of jurisdiction. Who's responsible for this particular piece of jurisdiction? Now, having taught Kevin Burke's children and knowing Mr. Burke and his politics, Mr. Burke takes it upon himself to make sure that he is going to get out there and have his say. Mr. Burke, of course, is concerned with the jurisdiction with federal legislation. I encourage other people who are in the legal profession to come forward on that topic, But I would like to table and take this opportunity to table a very helpful bill, Bill C-214. It's an act, and I'm going to read it if I may just for a moment, if the page can stand there for a minute, please. An act to prevent the use of the internet to distribute pornographic material involving children. The author of that particular bill is the good member from Sackville, Eastern Shore, Peter Stauffer. Now, he happens to be of the party that we belong to, but we're above politics in this situation. There's a particular piece of legislation that is dealing with the issue in the right federal parliament. That's something that I hope the members of the Justice Department have looked carefully at and realize there is something that we should be listening to. Mr. Speaker, in the meantime, I've heard from a number of other people, not just police officers, not just men and women involved with ICE, and I certainly share the comments of the minister opposite. An horrendous crime takes place, and these professional officers have to deal with the issue, particularly when the ICE division is involved. I cherish the work that they do. If this legislation can help out ICE, if this legislation is the sort of thing that police officers can say, that will help us with more charges and more convictions that will stick, you will see no member in this House stand in the way of this particular bill. No member at all will stand in the way. I want to, however, share with the minister opposite that I heard from a public librarian, a librarian in one of the libraries here in the HRM, who's very concerned that there's some kind of insinuation that he and his staff would not do the right thing and report this. As a Nova Scotian, as he said to me, and he would like to remain anonymous if he may, Mr. Speaker, as a Nova Scotian, he knows his duty, and he is certainly willing to report and step up, and if such a thing happens in the public library where he works and he's responsible, the HPD, the RCMP would be contacted immediately. That's the insinuation, that there are Nova Scotians out there who are not doing that. Those are some of the types of calls that I've received. It's a piece of legislation that this caucus looks forward to supporting and going on to law amendments. I hope it's a piece of legislation aimed in the right direction, aimed at this key factor: more charges, more questions than answers, but more importantly, more convictions for these horrendous crimes. So with those comments, Mr. Speaker, I will take my place. I look forward to having various people appear in front of law amendments, but at that time, I'm sure we'll hear more from the public of Nova Scotia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise and make a number of comments on Bill 187, the Child Pornography Reporting Act. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to start off my comments by referring to the same editorial that the previous speaker spoke to on the date of November 2nd, 2008 in the Chronicle Herald. It's with the headline, "It's a bill with no bite." And in that, I'd like to quote where it says, "Political posturing is the only point in bringing in a law that will seldom result in prosecutions." Premier Rodney MacDonald set the trap for opposition parties last week, saying if they vote down this piece of legislation, it will demonstrate their lack of zeal for child protection and public safety. That suggestion is ridiculous. It will merely demonstrate their belief that this is a futile exercise in legislating common sense or basic acts of citizenship. No one is turning a blind eye to child porn. Mr. Speaker, in my 10 years in this House, to have heard the Premier of this province tell the media that any member of this House who does not support or question this bill is somehow sympathetic to child porn or soft on child porn is one of the most offensive and reprehensible comments that I have ever heard in my 10 years. And I do hope that the Premier, who I know is a decent person, will take the opportunity in this House to withdraw those remarks, because even though they were not made in this House, they were made just outside this chamber. And such a suggestion, Mr. Speaker, to legislators from a Premier of a province, as I said before, is absolutely reprehensible. And the decent thing for the Premier to do would be to withdraw his remarks, because the Premier would see not only what the Chronicle Herald has said, but other media outlets and Nova Scotians have said. They have questioned the legitimacy of this bill and whether it will achieve any results. and those Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, are decent people and are not soft on child porn, or do they not care about the issue of child porn? And again, I hope the Premier will take the opportunity to withdraw those remarks. Mr. Speaker, I also want to start off by quoting my own comments, which were reported in the Chronicle Herald on Friday, October 31st, 2008, where it said, quote, "But Liberal Justice critic Michelle Sampson said he thinks Nova Scotians are doing the reporting now, and he's not sure what a new law would achieve." And it has, quote, "We want to make sure that the government is actually focused on getting real results here, rather than just thumping their chests and making it look like they're doing something," end quote, he said at Province House. Quote, "Anything that we can do as legislators to diminish or to punish or to catch people who access child pornography or possess child pornography, we are in full support of. The question today is, will this bill actually achieve that? Or is it merely a smokescreen to give Nova Scotians the impression that the government's actually doing something?" End quote. Mr. Speaker, that was the question that I had as a Liberal Justice critic on Friday, October 31st, 2008. And it is the same question that I have today as a Liberal Justice critic, November 14th, 2008. Is, will this bill actually achieve more prosecutions and will actually apprehend more individuals who either access or possess child pornography? And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that since this bill has been tabled, I have not seen anything to give me a sense of confidence that this is actually going to make a difference in the battle against child pornography. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've suggested before in my comments that I quoted that was this merely a smokescreen, a ruse, a political ploy, an attempt to get media attention. In questioning that, I would submit to Nova Scotians and to members of this House that this Minister of Justice, and in fact his predecessor as Minister of Justice, I would compliment in that in the last number of sessions they would have their staff meet with us, the opposition critics, review the legislation, and be available to answer any questions we had. Now, if the Minister of Justice is to say this is not about politics, this is a sincere belief I had, and I want the opposition support to get this done, why was that opportunity to be briefed beforehand not made available to us? What was done instead, Mr. Speaker? It's bad enough when there isn't the opportunity to be briefed for the opposition critics, when there was basically a pattern that had been established. But what makes this bill even more suspicious is that it was leaked to the Chronicle Herald before it was even tabled. Front page of the Chronicle Herald is who broke the story on October 29, 2008, when it said, "Tough new child porn law coming, Tories to make it mandatory to report abusers to police." So no discussion with the opposition, no attempt to seek our support, no attempt to answer our questions, no attempt to provide us with information that might convince us that this was actually going to achieve results. Instead, not only do we not get the briefing, it gets leaked out to the Chronicle Herald. It says, quote, "It speaks to the McDonald's government get tough on crime agenda," the source said, famous source. Quote, "It follows along the theme of putting more boots on the street, hiring more police officers, and this is giving those police officers another tool in trying to track down predators," end quote. So was it all for optics? Nova Scotians will have to render their own conclusions. But the question that we often have as legislators when legislation is brought before us is, who is pushing for this legislation? Because if it's meant to address an existing problem, then who is it that is asking for this legislation to be brought forward? Because it's very telling at times to see who is bringing about changes. Because I remember the previous Minister of Justice had brought in changes to our court system. And when the question was asked, well, who's pushing for these changes? It ended up that it wasn't who it should have been. It wasn't the Barrister Society. It wasn't the Society of Nova Scotia Judges. It was actually an idea that had been put together and it was brought to the floor of the House. And what happened in that case, Mr. Speaker? The right thing was done. The bill was withdrawn. Because obviously, it had not come from those it should have come from. and the idea was something that was not universally supported or shared by those in the judicial community. So we asked, or I shouldn't say we asked, I had the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to attend the minister's press conference, where he was flanked by police officers, RCMP, Halifax Regional Police Department officers. And the press conference, needless to say, Mr. Speaker, the fact it lasted almost 40 minutes didn't go as planned for the minister. But the question was asked repeatedly, who asked for this bill? If you're saying it's a tool for enforcement officials, is it the RCMP who asked for it? Is it the Halifax Regional Police Department that asked for it? Is it another municipal police force here in this province? Is there a society that made the request? Who asked for this? And the answer, Mr. Speaker, as we all recall, is that and I can again quote the Friday, October 31st, 2008 copy of the Chronicle Herald, where it states, quote, Mr. Clark confirmed after several questions during a news conference that police in Nova Scotia didn't ask for a new law, though they support it and are working with the government on the details. So at that point it became clear this was an idea that came from the minister and from his department or from his government, maybe the premier, based on the comments he's made. Maybe he was the one who had this idea. But at that point, we then knew this is not coming from the police. So that was interesting. So this is the government telling the police what's good for them and what will work and what will not work, rather than the individuals who the minister spoke of before, those who work in this unit. Mr. Speaker, how does one even describe the work that they do? Yet, rather than have them come forward and say, here's what we think will help us, the Minister of Justice instead says, no, I'm the Minister of Justice and Attorney General. I'm going to tell you what's going to help you to get your job done. So that's fine, and I believe the police were there, and they said, well, it's another tool, maybe it'll work. So then the question was asked to one of the police officers, after 4 years of working on child pornography cases, the question was asked, have you ever encountered a situation in your 4 years where you have charged someone with child possession only through the investigation to find out that someone obviously knew about this and chose not to take action? Basically exactly what this bill is meant to address, Bill 187. And again, in the Chronicle Herald of Friday, October 31st, it says, quote, Detective Constable Chris Gorham, a Halifax Regional Police officer who has been dealing with child pornography cases for 4 years, said he couldn't recall any case in which someone was aware of child pornography and didn't report it, end quote. So again, Mr. Speaker, when legislation comes forward, as I said, one of the questions that we ask is who's pushing for the bill? Now we know the answer to that. It's the Minister of Justice and the government, not the men and women who work in this field every day and trying to bring forward charges and prosecutions. So the question is, the other question we ask is that what specific problem does this bill mean to address? So one would have to conclude that the minister feels that Nova Scotians, who I believe are good, decent, honest, and truthful individuals, the Minister of Justice and his government is basically saying, we don't trust Nova Scotians. We think they're turning a blind eye to child pornography, that they're aware of it, they're turning a blind eye, and now we're going to get them with this bill. Now, what kind of message is that sending, Mr. Speaker, to Nova Scotians? The minister is basically saying, I'm going to legislate Nova Scotians doing the right thing. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have a hard time accepting that, because as I said before, I think Nova Scotians are good, honest people. And if they see a wrong that is taking place, especially one as horrific as child pornography, they're going to do the right thing. I don't think any Nova Scotian is scared of the consequences of doing the right thing when it comes to child pornography. I have a hard time accepting that anyone would be scared of that, because how could you be wrong? Or how could you be in any sort of trouble if you were to report such a thing? But obviously this government feels that Nova Scotians aren't responsible enough and need to be told through legislation that they need to do this. So the question becomes, Mr. Speaker, we know that this is not an idea that's come from this minister or from Nova Scotia. It's been tried in other jurisdictions. Manitoba has had it in place for a full year. Ontario was just recently adopting similar legislation. So the question at the press conference, one of the officers, I'm trying to remember if he was Halifax Regional Police Department or RCMP, but he had been in Manitoba for a number of years. And so the question was asked to him, since the law this mandatory reporting law has been put in place in Manitoba, how many convictions or how many charges have been brought forward under that law? The answer, Mr. Speaker? None. So what is this really meant to achieve, Mr. Speaker, is the question. Is the problem the fact that the minister truly believes that Nova Scotians won't do the right thing? I have a hard time believing that this minister would actually believe that, but what other conclusions are we to reach when we see this type of legislation, when we see the fact he did not share it with the opposition critics beforehand? And may I also suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, that based on my own comments in the media, based on the comments from the justice critic of the NDP, both expressing concerns of this legislation, may I also share with you and share with members of this House and with Nova Scotians that there's been no attempt by the Minister of Justice to address our concerns or to offer us to meet with his departmental staff or to meet with anyone else to address the concerns we have raised or to try to somehow convince us that this legislation should be supported. And that leads me to conclude that he follows along the same line of thinking as the Premier in saying anyone who questions this bill or would not support it must be soft on child porn. And again, I say shame on the Premier for even making such a suggestion. Because at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians look to us as legislators to deal with the real issues facing them. And if we're going to pass legislation, one should do so on the belief that it's actually going to make a difference. And that is what is lacking in this bill, is any sort of an indication that it would make a difference. Because I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, my comments would be completely the opposite if the minister had stood here and said that it's individuals such as Detective Constable Chris Gorham of the Halifax Regional Police, who's worked for 4 years in this, who's asked for this tool. Or is the RCMP, who have been working on this, who are asking for this tool. Then my comments would be completely different. Because obviously, they are experts in dealing with this in a very tough profession, under difficult circumstances, and yet, after 4 years, they haven't asked for this, because they haven't seen it as a problem. And I believe that they share my view that Nova Scotians are good, decent people, and they would do the right thing should they come across this. And we've also heard of service technicians with computers who've indicated that they have already reported to the police when they've come across such a situation. So who are we really going after, and what are we trying to achieve here with this bill? And again, the question is, one of the other questions would be, will this bill actually make a difference? Will we see prosecutions on this bill? Here's the other question that was raised, Mr. Speaker, during the press conference, which I think is a legitimate one, because there's only a limited amount of officers who deal with child pornography. One of the questions was, do we want those officers focusing on individuals who access and possess child pornography, or do we want them to focus on chasing down innocent Nova Scotians who are being accused of having seen or having witnessed that someone may access or possess this and didn't report it? Is that what we want the police to be doing? I think that's a legitimate question. But one of the questions I have, Mr. Speaker, is that if the government is truly sincere about this, will the minister, prior to asking us to vote on this legislation, commit additional officers and resources to combat child pornography in this province? Because that in itself, Mr. Speaker, would be an indication that the government is serious, that this is not just about another platform to put in their next campaign, to say, look how tough we are on child pornography. We passed a bill. Because without resources and without additional monies, this will not really achieve anything. Because there's only, as I mentioned before, there's only a very limited amount of officers who are actually working on this. And therefore, if this is a sincere effort by the government to get tough on child porn, I believe that this bill, without more officers and without more money, is a really difficult bill to support without that being a condition of it. And I would hope that the Minister of Justice would take time to reflect on if he is serious about this, after the concerns I have raised, the concerns that the member for Timberley Prospect has raised, that the Minister will come back and discuss with us what type of options and what type of support will be given to the police, other than just a piece of paper, that they will be given additional officers and additional resources to assist them in combating child pornography here in Nova Scotia. But Mr. Speaker, being that we're talking about justice, I think it's an important time to remind Nova Scotians of some of the concerns that we have raised about justice in this province. Mr. Speaker, in order for Nova Scotians to have a well-functioning justice system, they need to have absolute confidence in our police forces, absolute confidence in our courts, in our court system, and absolute confidence in our penitentiaries here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, let me start with our penitentiaries. Nova Scotians, starting this spring, started hearing of wrongful releases. People who had been brought to jail only to be let go. The minister at the time said it was a paper error. We're going to fix it. Fine. Then we had a second release. The minister said, another paper error, we're going to fix it. And then a third release. And then this fall, a fourth release, Mr. Speaker. Yet the minister says, well, I'm not going to go on a witch hunt for someone who made an administrative error. Mr. Speaker, he missed the point. He told Nova Scotians in the spring, after the 3 wrongful releases, that he had put the changes in place to make sure this wouldn't happen again. But it did happen again. And even better than that, he turned around and said, well, look, I've learned my lesson, and we're taking care of this because now we've promised to let Nova Scotians know when someone's wrongfully released. Quite cold comfort, I must say, Mr. Speaker, that that's what we're going to get, rather than the minister give us assurances that he is going to do everything in his power to make sure this doesn't happen again. He turns around and tries to console us by saying, don't worry, from now on, I'll at least let you know when it happens. Mr. Speaker, needless to say, that has not given us much confidence at all. Because, Mr. Speaker, we all recall the tragic incidents with Teresa McAvoy, and the fact that there again was an example of where our justice system had failed, and that a young offender who should have been kept in custody was not kept in custody because of a paper error, because of a faulty fax machine. Mr. Speaker, we were told by the Minister of Justice that we had learned from that, and that those problems would be fixed. And yet here we are seeing wrongful releases from our prisons. One of the individuals, when he was captured, had a loaded pistol in the car with him. Are these the types of individuals we want walking the streets of Nova Scotia? The minister and his government on one hand say we're putting more boots to the streets, but I never thought that they also meant that those more boots would be to assist in finding these inmates that were wrongfully released. That's not the way our system should work. And there's obviously a problem within our penitentiary system. And the Minister of Justice response is, I'm going to have a report. I got a report coming. Don't worry, report's coming. I think the leader of the NDP indicated that the minister is more interested in reading reports than taking action. And I have to reach the same conclusion. Because just yesterday, the leader of the Liberal Party once again raised the serious issue of another stabbing of an inmate at the Burnside Correctional Facility.
At least it wasn't Wayne this time.
Well, the Minister of Justice said, well, no, it was a stabbing, but it was only a broken CD case. That's not a real stabbing. Well, I'm curious as to see what the victim has to say about that, Mr. Speaker, if he thinks it's not a real stabbing because it was just a broken CD case. But he said it wasn't a knife, it was just a broken CD case, a sharp piece of plastic. That's not a knife. I'm almost thinking of the, what's his name, the Australian character there who talked about it not being a real knife. Crocodile Dundee. Well, that's I think our Minister of Justice must have been reflecting on watching Crocodile Dundee movies and saying that wasn't a real knife, it was just a broken CD case that he was stabbing someone with. Mr. Speaker, I truly believe that Nova Scotians have a great deal of confidence in our correctional workers here in Nova Scotia and our jail guards. They work under difficult circumstances, and they are part of a justice system to keep our streets safe. Yet when they come to us and continually say that they now fear for their safety in their work environment, and yet the Minister of Justice says, well, we have an Occupational Health and Safety Committee to deal with that. So, Speaker, these people have already gone through that process. And yet, while the government drags its feet when they're asking for stab-proof vests, the government found a way to allocate $230,000 for child-size ATVs. Yet, they tell the jail guards, deal with it in your committee, we got a report coming, we don't have the money to buy you the equipment that you're asking for. Now, what kind of message is that, Mr. Speaker? $230,000 for kiddie-size ATVs, yet cannot find the money to keep our jail guards safe. Now, Mr. Speaker, when the Burnside facility was first built, it was a modern facility in its day. The whole idea being that the outlay of the facility was such that it was going to be very safe for the inmates and for the staff. Yet we all know that this is the government, not only this premier, I must point out that he was just a minister at the time when this started, but his predecessor, Premier Ham, starting in 2001, closed rural jails throughout Nova Scotia. In Guysborough, 6 beds were closed. Lunenburg County, 23 beds were closed. In Truro, 50 beds were closed. And in Kings, 59 beds were closed. A total of 138 less jail cells here in Nova Scotia. Yet somehow, the minister and his government didn't draw the link that if you're going to get tougher on crime, you can't be closing 159 cells.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
I'm listening to this debate with some degree of interest, but he neglected to say that the new Burnside Jail was a creation of his government, and that's what led to the closure of these other things.
Thank you for the point of information. Recognize the Honourable the member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, the revisionist history that we get from the good Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations never ceases to amaze me, because they were actually in office for 2 years when they closed down these rural jails. So again, as I was saying, government's saying, let's get tough on crime, put more people in jail, yet they closed 159 cells and didn't replace them. So what happened? We have overcrowding in our jails. So the Burnside facility, which was initially built to be a single cell facility, single inmate per cell, suddenly the government said, well, hold on now, we can make it into double occupancy because we can put these portable beds on the floor. Now, Mr. Speaker, if it was the intention that the Burnside facility should be able to house 2 inmates per cell, it would have been built that way. You would have had 2 beds per cell. But that was not done, because it was never meant for that. But the government found a clever way of saying, let's put 2 inmates in the same cell. Now, I'm sure knowing this government, and they'll get tough on crime that they continue to tell us, said, who's going to have sympathy for inmates in a jail? Like, who's going to come and say, the poor criminals, they're stuck 2 people to a cell? You know, who's really going to say that? They're right. There's probably very little sympathy for those inmates. But I'll tell you where there is sympathy and where there is concern is for the men and women who are paid by the province of Nova Scotia to keep peace and security within those institutions. And when they come forward and they say, we fear for our lives and we fear for our safety, that's not something that the minister should stand this out and say, they got a committee to deal with that. They deserve more respect than that. They deserve better, and they haven't gotten it from this minister. When you see of stabbings and you see of these shanks being built and jail guards being threatened with them, and yet the minister says they've got a committee to deal with that, that is simply not acceptable. And again, as I pointed out, when they wanted to find $230,000 for kiddie-sized ATVs, they found it. Yet somehow now there's no money to protect our jail guards. But there's a history of this from this minister, Mr. Speaker, because we'll all recall the escape of Mr. Carvery, when the jail guards who were escorting him to a hospital visit under this government were not permitted to bring with them the tools which they are trained to use within the correctional facility, that being pepper spray and batons. After that escape, high-profile escape, the gentleman's still not in our jurisdiction, we naturally said, why would you allow jail guards within the jail to be able to use pepper spray and batons for their own protection and the protection of others, yet you don't allow it the minute they walk out the door with these dangerous criminals? And we all know Mr. Carvery's rap sheet. This is not the type of person that we would consider to be a routine transfer. Yet that is the situation the government put these jail guards under. And yet, even after that incident, The Minister of Justice refused to budge. No way. He said, we'll get the sheriffs to come in and transfer them if the jail guards won't do it. He would not arm them. So what does it take? It takes the Minister of Labour. A reasonable person looks at the situation and says, doesn't make any sense not to arm them. If you're going to have them trained within the facility, why would you not allow them to use this during escorts? So, fortunately, a bit of common sense from the government, from the Minister of Labour. So the Minister of Justice was forced, embarrassingly, to admit that these jail guards should be given the same tools which they have within the jail facility. But it's my understanding, Mr. Speaker, there's a period of training that's going on before that's going to become a reality, so it's not fully implemented just yet. So, Mr. Speaker, there seems to be an issue between the jail guards and this Minister of Justice. And maybe the Minister can share with us what the problem is. Because I can tell you, we don't find it acceptable to hear stories of jail guards saying that they fear for their safety because of the double bunking, because of the fact that they don't have enough staff for the amount of inmates that they're responsible for. And then we hear these incidents of violent behavior in the jails, and yet the Minister says, send it to the committee, the Occupational Health and Safety Committee. Mr. Speaker, we expect much better than that from this Minister. Yeah, Mr. Speaker, it's not only the jail guards. This Minister, for some reason, seems to have a problem with assuring the safety of his own employees. Because just last week and this week, we had the Crown prosecutors saying they do not feel safe working at the Spring Garden courthouse facility. They gave examples of how the guards who are there have seized weapons, knives, all sorts of things that cause a danger to them. So what does the Minister of Justice do? Well, I fully expected he'd have a report. But it gets better this time because he said, well, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to walk right down to the Spring Garden courthouse, and I'm going to check it out for myself. So apparently that's what he did. And he said, there's no problem with safety here. I don't know what they're talking about. So again, Mr. Speaker, why is the Minister of Justice always against providing the necessary safety and caution for his own employees, and instead hides behind reports, and instead decides on his own arbitrarily that this is not necessary? Again, I ask, what would the cost be of putting in full-time metal detectors at the Spring Garden Courthouse? Now, we know the Spring Garden Courthouse is one of the busiest courthouses there is in this province. Drive by it any day and you're going to see people coming in and going out. It's a very busy place. And unfortunately, it deals with some sensitive matters and some individuals who, at times, I think Nova Scotians would consider to be dangerous. And yet, right now, they do not have a permanent metal detector at that facility. Yet how ironic, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister of Justice comes to work here in this legislature knowing that everyone in the gallery and everyone here has gone through security and gone through a metal detector. Ironic, I would say. Some might point out some hypocrisy with that as well. But Mr. Speaker, clearly, I cannot understand how the Minister can talk about wanting to have safer streets and more boots on the street when he turns around and neglects the men and women who are part of that justice system. Yes, it's important to have more police, but we cannot forget about those who are working in our prisons, those who are working in our courthouses, those who are within the administration of justice in this province. They simply cannot be cast aside, and that there be no attention paid to them at all. So, Mr. Speaker, these are issues which causes us great concern when it comes to justice issues here in this province. I could talk as well about the issue of tasers in this province, and how when this first became an issue, the Minister was given an opportunity to put a moratorium, yet he refused. Then we had the unfortunate story of what happened to Mr. Hyde, which I now understand is going to become part of an inquiry which I'm sure, knowing what past inquiries have cost, will be a significant cost to taxpayers. And the question is, will action be taken as a result of that inquiry, and will the Minister actually learn anything from that experience? It's now become clear through media reports that even the RCMP are acknowledging that there's not sufficient training for their own members when it comes to the use of tasers, and that they wish to see changes being made there. Yet the Minister of Justice response is, I'm going to ask for a report. So it's another report. I think he's got 3 or 4 on the go right now, as we're having a hard time keeping track of which report's which. But one of the requests, one of the reports apparently that was done on the Burnside jail has now been presented to the minister. And the union has rightfully asked, can we sit down with your officials, review the report, review its recommendations, and see how we can work together to move forward. Maybe the Minister of Justice can indicate to us whether he intends to do that. I haven't seen anything, any reply to their correspondence which would indicate that the Minister has any intention of doing such a thing. But that certainly would be an indication to us that the Minister takes these concerns seriously, because I would hope that when he stands, he will tell us exactly, other than these reports and other than these committees, what concrete action has he taken to address the safety concerns that have been brought directly to his attention. Because, Mr. Speaker, I should point out that there's actually a number of other justice bills which are before us, and again, they all touch on our justice system, and it will be another opportunity to discuss these justice issues further. And I do hope that we are going to be given some indication of exactly how the Minister expects to address some of the concerns that we have pointed out here today. Mr. Speaker, I should point out as well that we have had concerns with this government's approach to justice issues for quite some time. You'll recall a few years ago where we had the issue of a rash of home invasions in the province of Nova Scotia. Unfortunately, for the most part, these home invasions were being committed by young offenders. So what was this government's response to this rash of home invasions? They sent out a DVD to seniors, a videotape, where they told seniors how to lock their doors and lock their windows. That was the government's response to home invasions. They didn't look at what were the root causes of these home invasions. Why were young people breaking into homes, in some cases very violently, causing damage and personal injury to what was mostly seniors within the homes? They didn't even look at that at all. Somehow they turned it around and saying seniors got to learn how to lock their doors better at night. And that's going to fix these home invasions. Now, needless to say, anyone with any interest in justice would question that type of an approach. And we have continually been talking to the government and encouraging them to deal with youth at risk here in this province. Mr. Speaker, one youth loss to a criminal behavior is one too many. We need to find ways, both to our school system and to our communities, to identify youth who are at risk and be able to provide them with the necessary counseling and support to make sure that they avoid a career of crime. Instead of speaking of that, we have a Minister of Justice who'd rather go to Ottawa and say, you need to give us more penalties under the Youth Justice Act so we can throw more of our young people in jail. What kind of an approach is that? Rather than saying, I want to try to make sure there's less young people getting in trouble with the law, my focus is going to be on nailing those young offenders who continue to get in trouble with the law. And yes, no Nova Scotian wants to see young offenders who are continuing to get in trouble with the law not be dealt with. But where are the efforts, on the other hand, to try to prevent this in the first place? That is where, in my opinion, in the opinion of our caucus, that the government has been lacking. Instead of giving us concrete examples of what can be done, the minister instead went on a tour with a petition. Want Nova Scotians to sign a petition. It's going to bring that to Ottawa and expect Ottawa to accept the petition. Well, what's ironic about that, Mr. Speaker, is that this is the same minister who once sat exactly where you're sitting as Speaker of this House, and when my colleague, the good member for Halifax Clayton Park, tried to have electronic petitions accepted in this House, he refused. Yet, his Department of Justice had a website where Nova Scotians could sign an electronic petition to be accepted in Ottawa. Again, Mr. Speaker, you have to question the sincerity when you see these kinds of events happening, where the minister, when he was Speaker, refused electronic petitions, but yet wants Nova Scotia to sign one now so we can take it up to Ottawa. So not only that, the minister decided to go on a road trip, touring the province of Nova Scotia, speaking to whatever group would hear him about the issues of youth crime and signing his petition. Was that a good value for taxpayers' dollars? Or would that money have been better spent on youth programs for youth at risk. It gets even better than that. If you look at your cable station and you turn to your Eastlink, for example, on the channel where there's ads, you see the Minister of Justice and hear him talking about crime and working together to fight crime in this province. And yet jail guards are asking for stab-proof and knife-proof vests, and he says send that to a committee. We're going to make our streets safer, but as far as those pesky jail guards, we just send that to a committee. The committee will deal with it. Mr. Speaker, any of the justice bills that are being brought forward here, I believe, need to actually have support for our justice system if they're actually going to be effective in making sure that we have a well-functioning justice system in this province. Because I can tell you, I believe the member from Timberley Prospect indicated that Nova Scotians' confidence has been shaken under this minister. Seeing these wrongful releases, seeing the Carvery situation, now hearing of jail guards concerned about stabbings, now hearing about the Crown prosecutors who work in a dangerous environment on any day, now saying that they're concerned about working at the Spring Garden Courthouse because of the instances of dangerous weapons which have been found by police in that specific facility. So, Mr. Speaker, we need to make sure that everything that we do is going to be to strengthen our justice system. One of the issues, Mr. Speaker, when talking about wrongful releases was the issue of the paperwork that the minister said. And he said, look, you know, I'm not going to go on a witch hunt for someone who had a problem with the paperwork. Well, I think there's a bigger reason than that, Mr. Speaker. It's not just that he wasn't going on a witch hunt, because if he did, he would have had to accept and acknowledge the fact that the clerical staff and administrative staff at our prisons are overworked. They have too much paperwork to do, and they cannot handle the volume of paperwork that is being put on them, especially now that there's double bunking. So if the minister had said, I'm going to get to the bottom of this and find out why the paperwork wasn't done right, it would have come out that, wait a minute, these people are being asked to do almost twice the amount of work they were before, and no additional support is being provided in light of that. So the easiest thing for the minister to do is say, I'm not going to listen to the opposition, I'm going to protect my employees. Well, that was a ruse that it didn't take us long to see through, Mr. Speaker. That was the real reason why the minister didn't want to pursue this, because he would have had to admit the problems that existed within the system and the absolute need for more support for this. And Mr. Speaker, it leads me to question that maybe the Minister of Justice is unable to get more money from the Minister of Finance. If that's the case, you know, obviously that would address a lot of the concerns we have, and it would certainly provide answers to this, that if he's been told that he will not be given more money to protect the safety of jail guards, sheriffs, Crown prosecutors, then he can certainly stand in his place and tell us that. That certainly, to me, would be a more legitimate answer than the minister's approach to date. Because, you know, I do believe him to be a reasonable person, but to hear someone tell you they're afraid to get stabbed, and your response is send it to a committee, that does not fall under reason to me. It's not a reasonable approach. Yes, we do have occupational health and safety committees, Mr. Speaker, in many of our workplaces in Nova Scotia. How many of those workplaces have to deal with the concerns over stabbing and their personal safety? I would submit to you that there's probably a limited amount of workplaces that deal with that. So it's one thing to tell a certain department, go to your occupational health and safety committee. It's a whole other thing to say it to men and women in a correctional facility who say that they fear their lives. That's simply not acceptable. And Mr. Speaker, it is our hope, and I believe the hope of all members and all Nova Scotians, that no jail guard or no personnel at our correctional facilities, no Crown prosecutor and no sheriff ever fall into harm's way. But we have a responsibility as legislators, and the government has a responsibility to be able to say, we undertook all reasonable steps to ensure their safety. And we can't guarantee there won't be incidents, but at least we can say we did everything that was reasonable in protecting our employees. I would question whether a minister can stand in his place and say that today. That he feels that he has done everything in light of the concerns that have been brought to him to ensure the safety of what in essence are his own employees, the men and women he has employed to work in our justice system. And Mr. Speaker, During the estimates earlier this spring, the minister did speak to us about the government's desire to build new correctional facilities. Lo and behold, finally. But yet, we don't have a construction date. I'm not sure if we have a site, and we don't have a completion date. And yet we continue to tell the jail guards at Burnside not to be concerned about double bunking and the extra concerns that that brings with it. So hopefully the Minister of Justice will take the opportunity to inform us what the status is of this new correctional facility. I believe there's two that are planned. One to replace the Antigonish facility and a new one in central Nova Scotia, if I'm not mistaken. Where are they at and when will they be ready? Because it is hypocrisy to suggest we're going to get tough on crime, yet we closed 159 jails, actual jail cells, and we haven't replaced them yet. You can't do one and not do the other, in essence, Mr. Speaker. So when it comes to Bill 187, our question again becomes, is this bill actually going to make a dent in child pornography here in this province? Or is it merely a smokescreen to somehow try to convince Nova Scotians that something's being done? Mr. Speaker, I believe when it comes to the issue of child pornography, we have a duty as legislators to do whatever we can to combat it. And I believe that all members of this House would support efforts to combat it. But clearly, based on the discussions that we've had, based on the response from the media, and based on the response from Nova Scotians, there is significant questions being asked is, are we really achieving anything with this bill? Will we see more prosecutions? Will we be sending the message out that anyone who accesses or possesses child pornography has a better chance of being caught? That is the question that we have here. And if the Minister of Justice can stand in his place and say absolutely, equivocally yes, that certainly is a whole different story. Providing a tool to the police that has no bite is no tool at all. And that's why we're a bit suspicious of this bill and the fact that the police never requested it. They did not ask for this tool. It is the Minister of Justice who said, I'm going to give it to you. If that's the case and he wants our support, I would suggest to you as a minimum, there needs to be resources put to assist police in combating this most horrific crime. Because other than that, it is a mere bill, which I'm sure the government will use during the next campaign as part of their justice platform. And the question is, at the end of the day, for all of us and for Nova Scotians, what did it achieve? And the way this bill was brought forward, being leaked to the Chronicle Herald, not being shared with the opposition critics, the Premier going out and suggesting that anyone who doesn't support this is soft on child pornography. You know, Mr. Speaker, that's right up there. I know his idol up in Ottawa, Stephen Harper, made the same comments. When opposition members raised questions about the Afghanistan war, the Prime Minister would accuse them of being Taliban sympathizers. What the Premier of this province said about this bill and about members of the opposition is no different. It is just as reprehensible as when the Prime Minister said that when members of the opposition would ask questions about the men and women who have lost their lives and who are fighting over there on behalf of our country. It falls right into the same line, and again, I do hope the Premier will show the decency of retracting those comments which he made. But again, Mr. Speaker, this is a bill which it'll be interesting to see whether we have groups that come forward at law amendments to say they fully support this. Here's the evidence of how it works. Here's the evidence of what results it will have. I'm still of the belief that Nova Scotians are good, decent people that know when to do the right thing. This government has a different approach. Will their approach be successful? Only time will tell. But it would be much easier to support this bill on final reading if we had some confidence that there's actually going to be convictions and an actual dent be made in child pornography here in Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, with those brief comments, I look forward to this bill, moving on to law amendments, and then having the opportunity to further discuss it at both law amendments and possibly back here in the House should it make its way back to this chamber. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. If I recognize the Minister of Justice, will be to close debate on Bill number 187. The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise to close debate on Bill 187. The issue at hand is a serious one, and if I thought, Mr. Speaker, through our intelligence and that we have, that we would be targeting innocent Nova Scotians needlessly when we know that our intelligence says that there's at least 5,000 active accounts of people from this province of Nova Scotia very regretfully and sadly accessing child pornography on a regular basis, then I would not, 5,000, Honourable Member, I would not come forward when we deal with that. And I do want to note, the member from Richmond, that our last allocation of police was to target more police for the ICE unit here in the province to provide more capacity and work with them as we roll out our policing complement for this province. Again, we are dealing with an issue that's been at the national table in terms of where does this come from. It comes from a national concern to deal with a global problem that we have. And as I started out, there are questions or concerns have been raised to which there are no answers about how many people do you know. By virtue of this debate in the House, Mr. Speaker, we may have helped a Nova Scotian by deterring somebody from accessing child pornography. If anyone has known of anyone as a child that has been the victim of child abuse, of which child pornography is, they would say anything you can do. If it's a public education piece, by virtue of this debate alone, it tells me that the act is worth it because we're talking about something that other people find very disturbing to deal with and don't know how to deal with it, Mr. Speaker. So for the men and women that work in our system, in terms of where does this come from, well, we've responded to them to provide additional resources for policing, to make sure we address those things through a due process. And as was indicated in the debate, indeed the province of Manitoba, the province of Ontario, and here in Nova Scotia, it wasn't just something thought up, it is about a thoughtful process to try and deal with that issue. And I am sincere in what I've said to any of the questions that have been raised, Mr. Speaker, that we'll be glad to provide that. And if throughout the process of law amendments or in third reading, indeed to present more statistics and very troubling statistics, but I also know this province went and changed legislation with regards to reporting of child abuse through the Child Protective Act. Indeed, to have that in place, this builds on this because it's a form of child abuse, because there is an effort and hopefully will be legislation for the country that will be supported. There is a reason why we put it in separately here in Nova Scotia, because I hope that there will be national criminal code legislation associated with this. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I do offer sincerely to all members of this House that we will provide the level of information that will make it possible for others to see the value in this piece of legislation, and that is to protect those that are most vulnerable, the children of this province, and indeed for those individuals out there, for them to be aware that we as Nova Scotians do not accept it. We're prepared to act on our disdain for this abuse by putting in legislation to use the public education piece, Mr. Speaker, that indeed we can build on that. And if the Parliament of Canada can act quickly and swiftly, then indeed I'd be happy to see this legislation superseded. But in the interim, I hope to move forward with our colleagues, because it's not something I'm going to politicize or trivialize. It is something, Mr. Speaker, I think we need to take in the seriousness of what this legislation attempts to address. And with that, I close debate on second reading.
Thank you. The motion before the House is for second reading on Bill number 187, the Child Pornography Reporting Act. Is the House ready for the question? The question has been called. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion carried.
Bill 187, title an act to make mandatory the reporting of child pornography.
Or that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable the Government House Leader. The Honourable the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 196, the Beneficiaries Designation Act?
Bill number 196. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to arise again to move second reading of Bill number 196, an act to amend Chapter 36 of Revised Statutes 1989, the Beneficiaries Designation Act. And Mr. Speaker, this is one of those items that helps protect individuals and their assets, and this allows for a new, it adds a tax-free savings account to the equivalency of a savings plan such as an RSP. And the most important factor of this with a tax-free savings plan, Mr. Speaker, is to provide those individuals an ability in a vehicle that allows them to make that investment and allows it as well to be transferred to a beneficiary and not be caught up in the probate process and or the fees from probate. And again, as another vehicle, especially as we've all been talking about and debating on certain economic times for those with financial assets, Mr. Speaker, that they want to invest and protect. This is a means for them to do that, and we see it as a positive step forward, and indeed expands the investment options of Nova Scotians. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to rise in moving this for second reading.
This is the honourable member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to make a few comments on Bill 196, amendments to the Beneficiaries Designation Act. You know, this particular piece of legislation makes some sense, particularly when you look at my new role as a grandfather, Mr. Speaker. Grandfather, of course, when my granddaughter Ella was born on May 11th this spring, immediately my wife and I said, we've got to make sure that we have some things in our place so that if and when the time comes in our lives, our granddaughter will have the finances, of course, to attend the best university in Canada, making sure that when her time comes at the age of 18 from the University of Alberta, she'll be attending Mount Allison in Sackville, New Brunswick. So I certainly am supportive of this particular piece of legislation. And from what I understand, of course, is this piece of legislation will be consistent with federal legislation. And that's a key thing. People who have the wherewithal and the finances of whatever amount now can make sure that this is not going to be caught up in probate court. This is not going to be caught up with further difficulties. But at the time of passing, you can pass on these dollars in the allocation which you desire. It's a piece of legislation that this caucus supports. It's based upon some good common sense. I look forward to it going to law amendments with our support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to make a few comments on Bill number 196, the Beneficiaries Designation Act. Speaker, the purpose of this legislation is to deal with the new program which was announced by the federal government in the budget of 2008, which is known as the tax-free savings account. Mr. Speaker, the tax-free savings account is a flexible, registered, general-purpose account that will allow Canadians to earn tax-free investment income. Now, what does that mean? How will this account work? Well, starting in 2009, Canadian residents age 18 or older will be eligible to contribute up to $5,000 annually to a tax-free savings account with unused room being carried forward. Mr. Speaker, with this tax-free savings account, the contributions will not be deductible. So it's different from an RRSP, a registered retirement savings plan, in that you cannot deduct this on your income tax. Capital gains and other investment income earned in a tax-free saving account will not be taxed. So that's your main difference between your RRSP, because your RRSP, you will be able to claim a deduction up front, but the difference is that with RRSP, you're going to get taxed when you withdraw it, whereas the difference with the tax-free savings account is that you will not be taxed based on any monies it earns or when you wish to withdraw that money. Speaker, as well, under the tax-free savings account, is that withdrawals will be tax-free. As well, neither income earned within a tax-free savings account nor withdrawals from it will affect eligibility for federal income-tested benefits and credits. Now, one of the questions I would have with that is that going to as well apply to Nova Scotia benefits, because we all know the problems with how the government here deals with the child tax benefit and people who are clients of community services. So I'll be curious, while this bill doesn't specifically address that issue, I'd be curious to see whether our province is as well going to put in the protection that any withdrawals from these tax-free savings account will not be part of the income test for any provincial government programs. Withdrawals will create contribution room for future savings. That being that if you've put money in and you take it out, you will still have that room available to you at the end of the day to put more money in should you choose to do so. As well, under the tax-free savings account, Mr. Speaker, contributions to a spouse's or common law partner's tax-free savings account will be allowed, and tax-free savings account assets will be transferable to the tax-free savings account of a spouse or common law partner upon death. Qualified investments include all arm's-length registered retirement savings plan qualified investments. And as well, the $5,000 annual contribution limit will be indexed to inflation in $500 increments. So that annual contribution is obviously going to increase. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm certainly not a financial analyst or anywhere close, but the whole intent of the tax-free savings account was, number one, to encourage Nova Scotia, not only Nova Scotians, but encourage Canadians to save. Unfortunately, in Canada and even here in Nova Scotia, a very small percentage actually save money for the future. We see that the rate of people who put in money into RRSPs is still very low, and so this is another tool meant to encourage Nova Scotians to save money. One of the groups that will benefit from this, Mr. Speaker, more directly, is anyone who's involved in a pension plan. Because when you are making contributions to a pension plan, it does limit your ability at the end of the day to put money aside into an RRSP. This tax-free savings account is irrelevant of whether you have a pension plan or of your income. It is a set amount that is available to you. The idea being is that the money will grow and it will be tax-free, and you can withdraw it at any time. So the purpose of this bill, after hearing this in the budget, is to make sure that upon someone's passing, if they held any money in this tax-free savings account, they can identify a beneficiary, and that beneficiary will receive that money tax-free, outside as well of any probate of the estate that will take place. So, needless to say, Mr. Speaker, I believe all members of the House would be supportive of that. But this also gives me an opportunity as well to remind Nova Scotians, as I've done before on a number of estate issues, is that I've once again seen a recent example where Nova Scotians seem to be confused when it comes to writing a will and when it comes to any insurance policies that they have. Nova Scotians need to know that whoever they put as the beneficiary on their insurance policy is who will receive those benefits regardless of what their final will and testament says. And I've seen numerous examples of where husband and wife will separate, and 20 years later, the husband has either remarried or moved in with someone, and yet upon his passing, his insurance, life insurance, goes to the first wife, which obviously clearly was no longer the intention after being separated for 20 years. But Nova Scotians and Canadians forget that when they change their status, whatever their status might be, they must recall that even though they changed their last will and testament, they must also change the beneficiaries on any insurance policies that they have. And I would submit to you that without getting the exact details of how the tax-free savings account will work as far as designating beneficiaries, it'll be curious to see whether that same policy will apply to the tax-free savings accounts as would apply to life insurance policies here in Nova Scotia. So, Speaker, the Minister of Justice in closing debate on the other bill said, well, if this debate today has given one Nova Scotian concern over accessing child porn, let me say, if this debate today reminds one Nova Scotian that if their status has changed, they would be wise to go and amend the beneficiary who's designated under their insurance policies, because regardless of what their last will and testament says, that is who will actually receive the benefits at the end of the day, which, needless to say, can cause a great deal of heartache for the family left behind, and it's certainly not a situation which anyone likes to see. So obviously, with this bill, Mr. Speaker, the government is addressing a need which clearly exists, and this is going to provide a result with a clear outcome. Very much unlike the previous bill we discussed, this one is much easier to understand the purpose behind it and the results that it will achieve. Those are not to be questioned. So, Mr. Speaker, I would be remiss if I did not note as well that this is another justice bill which was not brought to the attention of myself or the critic of the NDP before this House sat, which again is in breaking with the tradition established by this minister and his predecessor of giving us the opportunity to find out what these bills are and answer any questions that we might have on it. So I simply would want to remind the minister that it may be much easier and the debate on these bills may be much shorter should we have been given the opportunity of advance notice on this legislation and having the opportunity to address any of the concerns that we have and any of the questions that we would have with that. But, Mr. Speaker, I do hope that while the federal government has announced these tax-free savings account, I do hope that there will be a significant awareness campaign that will be undertaken on this, because this is an opportunity, a good opportunity for Nova Scotians to save money, but there certainly needs to be a level of awareness that goes with it, because as I mentioned earlier, there is a great deal of confusion as to how it applies for an RRSP and how different this tax-free savings account will be. But it's my understanding, Mr. Speaker, that financial planners have been given the details surrounding the tax-free savings account, and I have no doubt that the financial industry will soon in itself be undertaking an awareness campaign and offering this as a plan to their clients as to another tool for them to be able to save their money. And I think it'll be important as well, Mr. Speaker, should Bill 196 have successful passage in this House, that the Minister would undertake to make sure that these financial planners and that Nova Scotians themselves are aware of the changes being made around the beneficiaries' designation for these tax-free savings account. How the Minister will communicate that, I'm curious, and maybe he's able to give us some indication of that in his closing remarks, because again, this is legislation which is important that Nova Scotians are aware of, not just be part of a political platform, but that they're actually aware of why we've brought this bill forward, how it's going to make a difference in their lives, and what result it is going to be able to achieve. So again, Mr. Speaker, anyone curious about the tax-free savings account, they can go to the website of the federal budget, which is www.budget.gc.ca, and we'll be able to obtain more information on the tax-free savings account should they wish to explore it further based on the discussion that we have had this afternoon. With that, Mr. Speaker, I do look forward to Bill 196 moving to law amendments, where if there's any concerns that go along with the bill, those could be shared with us at that point in time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. If I recognize the Minister, will be to close debate on Bill number 196. The Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleagues for their intercessions with regards to this bill. Again, something that we can provide another mechanism and tool for Nova Scotians in responding to our side of a federal bill and process. However, we will, as we go forward, Mr. Speaker, if there's any questions that arise, we can address that. And with that said, Mr. Speaker, close debate.
Thank you. The motion is for second reading on Bill number 196, Beneficiaries Designation Act. Is the House ready for the question? Question has been called. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion carried.
Bill 196, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 36 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Beneficiaries Designation Act.
Or that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable, the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 201, the Counseling Therapist Act?
Bill number 201, Chair recognizes the Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to stand today and open second reading on Bill number 201, the Counseling Therapists Act. Counseling therapists throughout the province are committed to providing Nova Scotians with high quality care and counseling services. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is a result of the collaborative effort and hard work of the Department of Health and the Nova Scotia Association of Counseling Therapists. This legislation will regulate the practice of counseling therapy for counseling therapists who become members of the Nova Scotia College of Counseling Therapists. The Act will establish a complaints and discipline process to enforce the standards and requirements and deal with concerns from the public. The legislation protects the public by requiring that a counseling therapist who use the professional titles counseling therapists, registered counseling therapist, registered counseling therapist candidate, or RCT, or any derivation or abbreviation thereof, meet the standards set out by self-regulated professional body. Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia Association of Counseling Therapists, soon to be called the Nova Scotia College of Counseling Therapists, have worked very hard to develop this legislation that will improve accountability to the public and improve the disciplinary process. Mr. Speaker, I know that many of us have been lobbied by the Association of Counseling Therapists, and I do thank my colleagues for bringing this to my attention, and I thank of course, the association for the hard work that they've done bringing this issue forward. I know in my local area, and as I had thanked during the introduction, one of my friends and previous teachers, Wendell Dion, for the work that he did towards this, and I know the service that he does provide to the public is a very good one, whether it be through educational counseling, which he is a teacher by profession, retired by the way, now, but still provides that kind of service, works with children quite regularly. But my first contact with counseling therapist was on the Critical Incident Stress Committee, and basically a group of therapists that get together depending on a call for a fire department or what have you when something tragic happens that they have to deal with. And I remember one time meeting with a group of therapists at that time as we had witnessed a tragedy when it came to a couple of young boys who had passed away by drowning. Mr. Speaker, they do provide a wonderful service to Nova Scotians, one that should be supported by a college, one that should be supported by practice guidelines, one that should be supported by a truly reactive system that will govern the practice of counseling therapy. Mr. Speaker, I know over the last number of days we have been starting to receive some letters from another couple of organizations, and we will try to take that information that they're providing with us to see if there's ways to address it within the existing legislation, or maybe something that might be able to be bring forward during the law amendments process to maybe even strengthen this act even more to take in all therapists within this province, whether it be addictions counselor, whether it be others. So, Mr. Speaker, there are, I believe, a good basis for this act. Again, thank the Association of Counseling Therapists for the work that they've done. And, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the comments of the members opposites towards this bill. So, Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege to move second reading of Bill 201, an act respecting counseling therapists.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege to always stand in this chamber to talk about pieces of legislation that are important, that is important to Nova Scotians. And like this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, I know those individuals who have worked a number of years to get to this point hope to see this process go through the process that we have in the legislature here, Mr. Speaker. I know, as the minister stated a few minutes ago, that there has been some letters of opposition to this piece of legislation. I've made note and have talked to many of the council therapists and those who have worked so hard to have this piece of legislation in place. And I don't take away from anybody who has any opposition to any piece of legislation that comes through this House, Mr. Speaker, and hopefully that they have opportunity, like at law amendments, to voice their concerns. And of course, through that process, you can always listen to those organizations to see what their concerns are and make a rational decision at that time. I know that, like I said earlier, this piece of legislation has been in the works for a very long time, and I hope that the government and the minister and his department have done the broad consultation that is needed with any piece of legislation. You know, I know firsthand, Mr. Speaker, about creating a regulatory body or a college to represent a healthcare profession, Mr. Speaker. I've been through that process myself as a paramedic, encouraging government at the time and working with government as an MLA to see legislation for that profession, the profession of paramedicine here in this province. And I can honestly say, Mr. Speaker, it takes a long time. As I stand here today, we still don't have an operating college of the Nova Scotia College of Paramedics or paramedicine operating in the province, and it's been in the works for close to 7 years. But I know that there's been broad consultation on that. Every interest group that works with paramedics or has any kind of interaction with paramedics have been consulted, have been asked about their opinion, and I would hope with this piece of legislation that has happened. As I said earlier, we're starting to hear some negative comments about the this piece of legislation, and I hope that the government can come forward and explain to those individuals what the process is going to be and what's going to transpire over the next little while in the process of seeing this piece of legislation go through the process and into law amendments, Mr. Speaker. So with those words, I hope that the government has done their job to the best of their ability to ensure that all interest groups had an opportunity to give their say prior to the introduction of this piece of legislation. And I look forward to those organizations coming before law amendments and voicing their opinions about this piece of legislation through the process that we have under this in this legislation or this legislature, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to rise and speak to Bill number 201, the Counselling Therapists Act. Mr. Speaker, if you take a look at the practice of this government, there seems to be some real extremes when it comes to the preparation of legislation. We have pieces of legislation that have never been any consultation with stakeholders, case in point being the Fair Access to Regulated Professions Act, which was tabled in the spring. And then we have pieces of legislation such as this legislation. Pay attention. We have this piece of legislation which has been several years in the making. Now, Mr. Speaker, this act, in our opinion, is one of importance to Nova Scotians because what it will do, it will clearly spell out the academic credentials and supervision that you have to have as an individual to acquire the use of designations such as registered counseling therapist and counseling therapist. A discipline process along with a complaints process is also established in this legislation. Mr. Speaker, counselors provide professional, confidential counseling therapy services to individuals and couples and families, and it's on a wide range of issues including, for instance, trauma, suicide, loss, grief, just to name a few. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians, I think, deserve to know that the therapist that they choose, whether it be a therapist who deals with personal issues or one who deals with mental health issues or emotional issues, has met a certain set of qualifications as defined in the Act. And it's also important for Nova Scotians to have a recourse should they wish to file a complaint against someone who will soon be registered under the Nova Scotia College of Counselling Therapists. And then also, Mr. Speaker, there's a disciplinary process in place should it ever need to be used. At present, Mr. Speaker, there is a huge gap in the statutory regulation of mental health professionals in Canada, and as MLAs, we should be commending the Nova Scotia Association of Counselling Therapists for their efforts, both professionally and ethically, to try and close that gap in this province. Mr. Speaker, some clear guidelines and scopes of practice serve to protect quality patient care, and this particular piece of legislation, as drafted by the Association, we feel will address those issues in the best interest of the patient, Mr. Speaker, that the prevalence today of e-therapy makes this issue all the more important here in this province. Today, anyone can establish an online therapy business and provide therapy to individuals via email. So gone are the days when therapy only happens face-to-face in an office where people can view credentials and such on the walls of offices, and where people can judge quickly when or if there's a good fit between the person seeking support and the therapist themselves. It's important, Mr. Speaker, to know these individuals are meeting the academic credentials and supervisions as will be required under this Act, why we feel that this Act will clearly help. Mr. Speaker, we cannot stress enough the importance academic credentials mean when it comes to being able to practice under this Act, and if we are to truly ensure that the best interest of the public from a safety perspective is being met, then academic credentials are paramount. Mr. Speaker, we look forward to the law amendments process when it comes to this bill. As my colleague from the NDP has stated, there has been some opposition to it. We know that. Mr. Speaker, as of to this day, it has not changed our mind. We think this is a good piece of legislation, and we are looking to see this piece of legislation go forward as tabled and become law in this province. So we want to congratulate all of the efforts of the members of the Nova Scotia Association of Counselling Therapists in development of this legislation, and we in the Liberal caucus commend them for their diligence and their patience, and we feel what they have presented here will serve the people of this province well, and we are most supportive, Mr. Speaker, of their efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll recognize the Minister of Health to close debate on, I'll recognize the Honourable the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to speak in support of this bill. Both the Minister for Natural Resources and myself share a constituency where many different people are educated in the counselling services through the excellent facilities at Acadia University. And so, Mr. Speaker, it's been an issue that we've both been lobbied on. I personally have a friend who's working out west who feels that if this bill had been in place and this designation had been protected earlier, that she might be able to be working here in the province of Nova Scotia, and is waiting eagerly to see this bill passed. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to support it and want to commend the Minister and the parties opposite for the support of their bill.
Thank you. I will recognize the Honourable the Minister of Health to close debate on Bill 201.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank all members for their comments on this, and of course for our member to have kept that short. Mr. Speaker, again, we think this is a good piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, though we are receiving a few letters in opposition to it, I think we'll review those to see how we can address those, and maybe during the law amendments process. Mr. Speaker, I think that's what this legislature is all about, to bring in good ideas and good pieces of legislation. If they need to be adapted, then they can be, Mr. Speaker. So therefore, I'm very happy again to bring this bill forward. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to move second reading of Bill number 201, the Counselling Therapist Act.
Thank you. The motion is for second reading on Bill 201. Is the House ready for the question? Question has been called. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion carried.
Bill 201, entitled An Act Respecting the Practice of Counselling Therapists.
Heard that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That concludes the government's business for today. I would move we do now adjourn to meet again tomorrow. The hours will be from 9 a.m. to noon. After the daily routine, public bills for second reading. Following bills: number 199, 200, 203, 204, 210, 211, and 212, 215, and 217.
Motion for adjournment has been made. Is it agreed? Agreed. The House will rise to sit again tomorrow at 9 a.m. We have 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. We have arrived at the moment of interruption. The adjournment debate was chosen and announced earlier and won by the honourable member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage. Therefore, be resolved that the government develop a comprehensive coastal management strategy through consultation with all appropriate stakeholders. Chair recognizes the honourable member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise and speak on this important resolution where I'm asking the government to look at developing a comprehensive coastal management strategy and consulting with all appropriate stakeholders. Coastal management is very important, I believe, to the province of Nova Scotia, and certainly it's an issue that has been batted around for many, many years. I just want to indicate how many years that coastal management strategy has been discussed, not only in this province, but also federally. Over 30 years ago, the Federal Department of the Environment commissioned a study through Dalhousie University on coastal zone management for the Atlantic provinces. That study identified then the need for a solid coastal management plan for the Atlantic provinces, which obviously includes the province of Nova Scotia. They identified many recommendations and the importance of a comprehensive coastal management strategy. They recognized that there would be an ongoing threat of climate change at the time, that the province of Nova Scotia and all Atlantic provinces would experience over the coming years coastal erosion, rising sea levels, frequent storms resulting in storm surges all around our coastal areas and also within our freshwater courses throughout the province. Development plays a huge role in coastal management. It was identified that much development was happening on our coastal lines, which sometimes would see development encroaching on sensitive wetlands and vulnerable ecosystems. It's just so important, and it's unfortunate that that study of 30-some years ago has sat on a shelf for that long and those recommendations never implemented. During the past 30 years as well, this province has seen many studies fall by the wayside and those recommendations never implemented on the importance of a clear, strong, concise, and comprehensive coastal management plan. I want to also let the host know that for 3 years I sat on the Planning Advisory Committee with the Region of Queens Municipality a few years back. And my time spent on that committee saw much discussion around coastal management for the coastal communities and also inland waterways throughout Queens County. It was recognized then at this committee level and also with the understanding from the region of Queens that coastal management, especially for developers, was very important, and that Planning Advisory Committee, through that recognition of a good coastal management plan, drew up a number of zoning bylaws that would see buffer zones for new development along our watercourses. The Planning Committee with the Region and Queens are still working diligently at seeing that planning document completed and move forward through all of Queens County. The province, though, should really be taking the lead on coastal management strategy for the province. Giving that role to the municipalities, while the municipalities certainly recognize the importance of coastal management, unfortunately, where the province has not taken the lead with a good coastal management strategy for the province, what we will eventually see is a mismatch of plans across the province. So one municipality may certainly have a clear coastal management strategy for one particular area of the province, where another area may not have addressed those same types of needs. So a property owner owning property in different municipalities may be facing actually a different set of guidelines in terms of any development or property ownership they may have on the coast. I also want to indicate that a coastal management strategy also should include not only the environmental protection that coastal management would offer, but also coastal management strategy could also include zoning and development conditions for industry, setting up shop in coastal communities. In the region of Queens, and in one of my coastal communities of Port Mattoon, we see a community and over 3,000 members of Queens in distress because of an aquaculture operation that is looking to expand in a coastal community off of the in the coastal waters off of the community of Port Mattoon Bay. Because there is no zoning or no industrial zones around the province or around the coastline of Nova Scotia, what we see is industry facing oppositions in communities, and there are no clear guidelines for either industry or communities that either support industry or don't support industry coming into their communities. It certainly would make sense for industry when they're setting up shop around coastal Nova Scotia that they can look at a zoning plan that they could say, this is where we can set up shop, this is where industry is welcome, or this is where industry will work. For